Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
So Gabby, I wanted to start off with kind of I don't know, I guess it feels like a goofy conversational question, but when you go to buy things at the store, you know, maybe it's a TV or you don't really buy cars at the store, you go to a dealership, right? But do you ever sort of consider the purchase that you're making and how much you're going to pay in tax?
I would say not often, but when it's a bigger purchase, yes, for sure. Because you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, you can end up paying on a car, you know, thousands of dollars.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So not all the time, but it is something to consider.
Yeah. And I ask because, you know, as I think you're noting there's a real cost depending on what you buy, that for some of us, you know, we may just write it off pretty easily and just sort of say, yeah, that's just the cost of existing in this state. But, you know, when there is a change that can actually have a real effect on people. And so with news, I think in recent years, you know, we hear stories, we make debates about in our newscasts about cigarette taxes. You hear about cannabis taxes. There's been those ideas of junk food taxes, you know, on soda and candy. But today, we're going to talk about alcohol taxes here in New Mexico.
Yeah, this year, the state legislature was poised to change how much tax is paid on alcohol. We'll get into the details soon. That plan was upended. But that being said, how much tax you pay on alcohol? What if we told you that research shows that cost could make a difference in alcohol-related deaths in New Mexico?
Of course, we know that alcohol has had a major impact on this state. Driving, for example, New Mexico's Department of Public Safety, they report that alcohol is involved in 40% of all fatal traffic crashes, making it the leading cause or the single largest factor in the state's traffic deaths. So that idea that changes to alcohol taxes could affect alcohol-related fatalities, it's kind of an intriguing one, right? Because it's this idea as well that is discussed in some newer research from the University of New Mexico.
Yeah, that brings us to our guests today. We are welcoming UNM Economics Professor Brady Horn, who had a role in this alcohol-related research, and State Senator Maestas, a Democrat representing parts of Westside Albuquerque. He's also played a part in a lot of legislation, including some funding for this research. Thank you both for being here. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us. Great to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you guys. And let's start with you, Professor Horn. You know, we mentioned you're an economics professor, but you have a specialty to your work. It sounds like you're a public economist focused on health behavior from what I read online. How long have you been at UNM? How do you describe your work, the research? How do you tell people what you do?
Oh, wow. I'll try to keep it short. I'm a professor in the economics department, also at the Center for Alcoholism, Substance Use, and Addiction. And I've been here 15 years, so I spent my whole professor career at New Mexico. I've done research in a lot of different areas, but how I would categorize myself is I do research the intersection of economics, obviously, substance use, and crime. So anything that covers those three areas.
Okay. And how long have you been doing it for?
Well, 15 years as a professor, and then 5 years as a grad student. So we're getting around 20 years that this has been my job.
My goodness.
Yeah, those are three topics that I think are very much of public interest here in New Mexico. Senator Maestas, you've got a different job, obviously, but it intersects with Professor Horn's work. You've been a state lawmaker since 2007, starting as a representative and then moving to the Senate in 2022. But you're also a lawyer and have had your hands in lots of public policy over the years, from taxes to criminal justice, right? How do you describe the work that you're interested in, involved in the legislature?
Thank you so much. So I'm the only former prosecutor in the Senate, so I do a lot of crime legislation. But I got a chance to study economics, not at UNM with the professor, but at the University of Washington. And I love the study of economics and public policy. At the end of the day, I'm a policy wonk. So there's nothing more wonkier than taxing a commodity with so many moving parts like alcohol and the social cost and things of that nature. So I enjoy the fiscal side of government, the appropriations process and taxing, but taxing for not just to raise revenue, but for a public policy purpose.
Okay. Interesting.
So let's talk a little bit about this alcohol research you're involved in, Professor Horn. I should note as well that we heard about this in the work that you're doing from another podcast, one called It's Probably Not Rocket Science, produced by UNM, hosted by a familiar face for us. It's News 13 alum Alexis Ganeski. So we heard about that podcast, thought it would be a great idea to bring both of you on because you both, again, intersect with this research here. There's a report titled the, quote, Impact of Alcohol Taxes and Liquor Licenses in New Mexico. But what was the jump-off point here for this research? What did you set out to look at generally, and how long has this been a project?
It's a great question. I think, well, I'll let Mo talk more about the process where we were funded by the legislature to do research. But my personal interest in it, like I said, I study economics, substance use and crime. And I got into this just starting off with a report thinking about the beer industry. So as you know, the craft beer industry was growing in New Mexico, and they were changing policies regarding how many liquor outlets there can be. So we wanted to know, will that have any impact on drinking and driving fatalities, crimes, and things like that? But as I got more into learning about alcohol, learning about beer, as the legislature moved, they started thinking about alcohol taxes. And UNM, we care deeply about policies. We have a subfield called public economics. So like Mo said, it's the intersection of government and economics. So thinking about how different policies and programs can impact New Mexico. And so we want to do our part to say, what is going to be the impact of these alcohol taxes? And so we wrote a report there, just a little bit more since then. That was 2023, we wrote that report. I've gotten very interested in alcohol taxes. So we have a number of different projects that are ongoing, thinking about alcohol taxes. And we have a graduate student at UNM, her name's Anna Milan Hinestroza, who's doing her whole dissertation on alcohol taxes. So this idea that started in 2022 has really budded into this big, long, ongoing project.
Yeah. And so this research, Senator Maestas, I understand, it was funded by the state legislature in years past as part of a funding bill, a fund for something UNM calls Research and Public Service Projects, or RPSPs. Can you tell us what are those, and just tell us more about the funding behind this research?
Let me just kind of back up. So I became the chairman of Commerce my last 5 years in the House. I was chair of the Commerce Committee, which deals with economic policy and businesses. And it was shocking the first year, all of the alcohol bills that went through that committee because they never got out. So I was fascinated with liquor licenses and liquor policy. We had a junior budget at that year, which is small appropriations that we can discretionarily give to. So I got some discretionary funding to the economics department to help us form good public policy. Our economics department division and the Secretary of Economic Development, they do a fantastic job, but they have different divisions and tasks statutorily. So we don't really have like a policy wonk arm giving legislators ideas on public policy and economics. So anyway, the professor and his colleagues did some great research on liquor licenses and things of that nature. Now, Speaker Egoff was big on research. Myself, we finally convinced our colleagues to invest in research, particularly at UNM State and New Mexico Tech. And so now it's heavily in the budget. We tried to follow the Florida model when they blew up Florida State, Florida, and Central Florida and made those schools like they were top 80 or 90 schools. Now they're top 20, top 30 schools. So anyways, that research has gotten down to the economics department to deal with these tax issues.
Yeah. It's interesting when you think about the larger, national conversation around universities being funded for research, a lot of federal funding with a big question mark on it. But you thought of this as a way to, fund it with state money.
Right, because, pardon me, we never had money before. But the oil boom about 5-6 years ago, now we have all this, we're sitting on tons of cash. Well, what do we do with it? How do we parlay this into a wonderful future? So we convinced our colleagues to appropriate tens of millions of dollars for research projects, primarily at our three major research universities. And it's paid off. All the money we put into research comes back, in the local economy.
Yeah, and it sounds like this research it's kind of this idea of like, let's spend the state money on research that can help us answer some of the really hard questions that we're legislating around in the state.
That was my thought process, that we need help as a citizen legislature. The governor is dealing with all kinds of issues statewide, the AG, everyone has their duties, but it'd be great to have this policy wonk arm, and I'm trying to put it into state structure. One of our interim committees hasn't panned out. So we're really grateful to Professor Horn and his colleagues giving us these wonderful research projects. In fact, the first research project the department did was on early childhood education that categorically said 1% for early ed would in fact lead to positive economic externalities, which was key in convincing those last holdouts of my colleagues.
Interesting.
And I think you described this as, research that does about New Mexico, that does good for New Mexico, something along those lines. You described this as in the just podcast interview you were doing with Alexa.
Just to add to what Mo's saying, there's a lot of aspects of research. So policymakers come to me and say, I want to know this answer in how about 2 weeks? And one great thing about the program that we have is it allows us to build research capacity. So you can't just create data out of thin air. So for instance, if we want to study crime, I'm on the New Mexico Sentencing Commission. We're working on building better data. So if people ask me, if we have a homeless program that houses people, will it reduce crime? Well, we don't know the answer unless we have crime data, or we're working with Medicaid to get better data on healthcare utilization. So not only can you have research projects now that will make, we'll know more about New Mexico, but also you'll develop research capacity in the future so you can answer more research questions.
So jumping back to the research we're talking about here today, Professor Horn, one of the things the team set out to evaluate was the impact that an increase in alcohol taxes would have in New Mexico on both alcohol consumption and tax revenue. So how did you arrive at looking at those factors?
Yeah, so let's just think about, I'll try not to make it too pedantic. I get my lecture hat on sometimes, but just thinking about it first, what is the mechanism that causes alcohol taxes to change behavior? So economists believe in incentives and we believe in markets. So as the price of a good goes up, people will consume less. So we know that's true. Alcohol is a complex good, and we can talk more about that if you want. But as the price goes up, consumption goes down, and then the bad consequences of alcohol consumption will also go down. So that's just the logic behind using markets. So when you're studying a topic, I think this is an interesting dynamic we have to play with the RPSP as well as presenting to the legislators. People want to know what's going to happen in New Mexico. But we have to use some sort of evidence from somewhere to think through that. So we may go into the legislature and say, well, Alaska passed this tax, or Illinois passed a tax, or Maryland did, and they say, well, that doesn't mean anything to New Mexico. So that's part of my role is if we're going to do research in New Mexico, we want to think through what is going to happen specifically in New Mexico. But sometimes to start our ideas of what will happen, we look at when the taxes have been changed in other states. So when they've looked at other states, you have seen changes in consumption, you've seen changes in crime, you've seen changes in, of course, alcohol-related fatalities. And so there's, of course, academics will quibble about details, and I can get more into the complex details if you want, but generally we've seen a reduction in consumption and a reduction in bad outcomes when alcohol taxes have been passed.
And when the price goes up, basically.
Yes.
Basic economics. Okay. As I understand, one of the conclusions from this paper is that raising the alcohol tax in New Mexico could reduce alcohol use by a certain amount, along with raising tax revenue by more than $100 million. Tell us more about those findings.
Okay, so there's a little bit more background. There's two different types of taxes. There's multiple ways you could tax alcohol, but the two predominant ones is one's called an excise tax and one's called an ad valorem tax. An excise tax is just a dollar amount on a gallon of beer or a liter of alcohol. And right now in New Mexico, it's 41 cents per gallon. It's a little bit more complex because we have lower tax rates for craft beer and local producers. So just to pause for a second, if you tax a dollar amount, and as we know, as we've seen inflation recently, what happens is that tax gets smaller and smaller and smaller over time. So if you just stick it at 41 cents, then you have to periodically increase it, or it's going to be lower on average. The other type of tax is an ad valorem tax, which is just taxing a percentage. So you will see that on, as you were talking before, you will see that on your bill. So it would be whatever the percentage you want. Some places have had 6% or 3%, and you can tax in that way. So the proposed bill in the past had a 25-cent tax per drink. That's a little bit of a unique tax. You have to back out, what does this mean, an excise tax or an ad valorem tax? That would amount to, there's about 10 drinks per per gallon, give or take. So that amounts to about a $2.50 tax, which would be a pretty big increase in the excise tax in New Mexico.
From 41 cents.
Yes.
And there's other issues with regards to that, is how we tax alcohol. A percentage is the best tax, because if you tax somebody 5%, it's 5% all the time. So if that dollar raises in inflation, 20 years later, you're 5% of $1.25 or whatnot. Alcohol, taxes on alcohol are as American as apple pie. I mean, Washington had to put the smackdown on some folks in Western Pennsylvania because they refused to pay their whiskey tax. And so the way you tax, so it's centuries old, so the way you tax whiskey and beer is by the barrel, where the tax guy would literally go into the warehouse, count up the barrels. You owe me this much dollars per barrel, or this many cents per barrel. So that exists to this day. So the economic relationships in the 20s, when alcohol was illegal, essentially got codified into law in the 30s. So you have the manufacturers who produce the alcohol, the factories, so to speak. You have the wholesalers. So by law, the liquor has to go to a particular wholesaler, and then they sell it to the stores and the restaurants and the bars. If I'm a restaurant, I can't buy beer from Milwaukee. I got to buy it from a local wholesaler. So we tax it from the factory to the wholesaler. We tax it from the manufacturer to the wholesaler, and that's an excise tax. Excise tax is a tax on a particular commodity. So a sales tax, or GRT, that's on everything. It applies to everything. Excise tax is, we tax this particular commodity differently. Most excise taxes happened before we had a modern sales tax, and so we haven't caught up. So the excise tax on alcohol is per liter, $1.60 per liter of spirit, what we call spirituous liquors, whiskey and liquor, and then it's different for beer, wine, and cider, which is per gallon or per. Anyway, so it's convoluted to change a tax if you don't understand how it happens in the first place. But at some point, we need to go to a percentage, because as the professor said, if you put a dollar amount in state statute, you have to adjust every 10 years, and we have not adjusted our tax on alcohol for over 3 decades.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
And I wanted to ask you a bit more about that. I mean, we know that alcohol's impacts, they're well known, right? It's not just the impacts it has on driving either, right? It's longer term health effects. It's contributing factors to things like crime, poverty, unemployment. There's a report out there produced by the state in recent years that says, quote, New Mexico's total alcohol-related death rate has ranked first, second, or third in the U.S. since '81, and first for the period between 1997 and 2010. So to that point, I think the bigger step back, and I get a sense of, I think I know what your answer is, but has New Mexico done enough to address the personal and the societal costs that people pay for alcohol over time? And particularly, like, looking at your time as a lawmaker, you've been in state legislature now for quite some time. Do you think that we've done enough in your time as a state legislature to kind of change and address how that alcohol is impacting our New Mexican society?
Not enough, certainly not enough. In the realm of DWI, we have, because we just attacked DWI with the kitchen sink approach. Sure. and dropped those numbers with regards to accidents and fatalities. But with regards to what policymakers call the social cost, we have not. The social cost of alcohol is incredibly high. The social cost of cigarettes is incredibly high. What's the social cost? Like, if I buy this pen, it doesn't really cost society anything. This cup, if it's not biodegradable, maybe it harms the environment, whatever. Alcohol.
Did an episode on microplastics.
Yeah, so alcohol has this incredibly high social cost because of alcohol in the home that may lead to domestic abuse, domestic violence, drinking, people's health conditions that you have to pay for either in taxes or your higher health insurance rates. So the trauma that New Mexicans have suffered historically, apparently, in my opinion, has contributed to this harmful effect that alcohol harms people in New Mexico more than other states as it relates to deaths. So we have the highest rate of alcohol-related deaths in the country, alcohol is taxed extremely low nationally. It's shocking how low alcohol is taxed nationally, and it's taxed incredibly low here. It's not even taxed the same as a normal commodity. If we eliminated the excise tax and the GRT jumped in overnight, we would collect more tax dollars because we taxed it specially prior to GRT. So it's crazy, but it's very difficult to increase. It impacts people personally, and the sponsors who are leading the charge have not found a good way to message the tax. So it's very, very difficult to raise it historically, and now it's difficult to raise it now because we have so much money in state government. So it's very unfortunate. And then lastly, with regards to mental health, or behavioral health rather, has not been a part of state government until the modern world, frankly, until recently. So in the 70s, 80s, 90s, behavioral health was not an aspect that government does. You could do it privately, but now we're trying to get Medicaid and other state coffers to pay for behavioral health. But behavioral health and the harmful effects of alcohol were not a government's concern until the modern world, which is the last 10 years.
Yeah. You talk about how difficult it is to get buy-in to raise taxes. I mean, that's just, I think generally speaking, when you talk about raising taxes, it's hard to get, public buy-in for that as well. But one of the core ideas in this research suggests that if New Mexico raises alcohol tax rates, the state stands to benefit in a myriad of ways, of health factors included. Professor Horn and Senator Maestas, can you give us an idea of where alcohol taxes stand in our state today? How do they work to the consumer? How does it show up on your receipt in a special category or something else?
I'll give a quick rendition and then turn it over to Brady. But when the manufacturer sells alcohol to the wholesaler, and there's 3 major wholesalers in the state of New Mexico, that wholesaler pays GRT. I call it sales tax, but it's GRT. It's imposed on the buyer.
Gross receipts tax.
The seller, yeah, gross receipts tax. So we pay $1. The wholesaler pays the government $1.60 per liter on spirituous liquors, 51 cents per gallon on beer, 45 cents per liter. We're back to liters for wine, and then 41 cents per gallon for cider. When the wholesaler sells it to the retailer, there is no tax. There is no tax. Theoretically, there's a GRT, but the GRT only happens once in the chain. But then when the retailer at the liquor store or the restaurant or the bar sells it to us, then it has just good old-fashioned GRT. So it's taxed just like any other drink.
Okay. Did you have more to add to that?
Well, alcohol's a real interesting good. So ever since Prohibition, and maybe before, but when they started selling alcohol again, they had 3 levels. So there was importers, there was distributors, and there's retailers. So it set up this really odd system where it's not a normal good, where a company makes tires and you can just sell their tires to whoever else. You have to go through these very specific processes. And at the time, it was designed this way to try to make sure alcohol was controlled, make sure there wasn't bad outcomes that happened pre-prohibition. But now this is causing somewhat complex and convoluted tax situations. And so what, like Mo said, we're taxing the distributors. And some of these distributors are related to the bigger companies, like Anheuser-Busch would be a distributor. So the excise tax is taxing these companies outside New Mexico. And when I talk about this, I want to make sure I don't mislead listeners. The distributors just increase the price. So if you have a 41-cent tax, some of that 41 cents will go up in prices for the gallon. So very small in New Mexico, but that will, the distributors will be taxed, but the prices will be passed on in at least some way to consumers.
Okay. Would you call New Mexico's liquor taxes at this point effective? But it sounds like what you guys are saying is they've diminished over time with inflation.
Well, I'll just say, what are we trying to do with alcohol tax? So effective, what does effective mean? I think we are somewhere in the middle of the nation in terms of alcohol taxes. So I think we're ranked something about 24th for at least beer taxes. But some states have very big taxes, and some states are pretty close to us. So a lot of people at the bottom and a couple people that are larger. These small tax increases, I don't think, have a big increase in behavior. Now, of course, economists don't we don't need big changes to make to make some change, right? So you increase a tax by 5 cents, will that impact behavior? Sure. You may not see it, but in some small way it'll impact your behavior. But large taxes will be more effective in reducing behavior if that's the goal of the policy.
And that's been the sales pitch of my colleagues is let's raise alcohol taxes to change behavior. That's not a winning pitch on the stump, so to speak. Like people don't want the government changing their behaviors. But I think the taxes is needs to be improved for several reasons. Number one, it's a dollar and cents. Don't put dollars and cents in state statute because it doesn't rise with inflation. We have not raised our gas tax, or our gas tax is the same rather since 1992, 17 cents per gallon. If it was a percentage, it would have gone up with as time goes on. So, for example, in 1938, we were taxing a liter of spirits 53 cents. That was in 1939. If it tracked with inflation, that would be $12.06 today. Oh boy! So here we are in 1939. We taxed it $12.06, or the equivalent thereof, and in 2025 it's $1.60. So, and then that's one problem. Two is it's regressive. Anytime you tax commodities, regressive, and that's problematic politically. But it's also regressive in and of itself because if I buy a $10 bottle of whiskey, that's $1.60 tax. But if I buy a fine, whatever, Cavassier or Hennessy, whatever, or Dom or what's that?
Don Perignon.
No, well, that's a wine, but yeah, I got our champagne.
Oh boy.
For what is it? Blue. Johnny Walker Blue.
Okay.
Anyway, if I buy a $100
top
bottle,
shelf.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I can't quite reach it, but if you buy a top shelf $100 bottle of spirits, you're paying $1.60.
Yeah.
So, so it's very inefficient in terms of a revenue aspect, in terms of how it's taxed from a policy standpoint, and it's just a weird commodity because a third of the people don't drink, and 10-15% of the people that do drink 40 or 50% of the alcohol consumed, and it creates a lot of problems. So to me, they're not really called sin taxes anymore, but alcohol, tobacco, other things that are questionable morally, historically, are called sin taxes. Anyway, if it has a high social cost, it should be taxed higher than the normal commodity. Alcohol is actually taxed less than the normal commodity.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about, where things stand right now, and this idea of what could happen if we raised those taxes. I know in the most recent legislative session, you were among the lawmakers who were considering all of this. We understand there was a change to the alcohol excise tax outlined in House Bill 14. This passed in both chambers of the legislature, was attached to a broader tax bill that would have done a lot of tax changes for other things outside of alcohol. This was, again, House Bill 14, but Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham vetoed this bill. Before we get into the aim of that veto, I did want to just ask, what were the changes that would have been made to alcohol excise tax under House Bill 14? As I understand, this would have really been the first time that we would have addressed changes to the excise tax in quite some time.
In quite some time. The excise tax has not been raised, I think, since 1994. And so there were modest increases 2 years ago that were vetoed, and then they were vetoed again. These were modest increases of, for example, I'll just stick with liquor, which is referred to in statute as spirituous liquors, basically 80 proof type stuff. It raised from $1.60 per liter to $1.92 per liter.
Okay. So about 32
cents or 22%. So as that correlates to a drink at the point of sale, it's probably maybe 2-3 cents or whatnot. But they were modest increases. And so that also begs the question on the flip side. Like I heard that the last veto, some of the alcohol folks were like kind of upset with the veto because now we're going to go back again. And so the next proposal, I would imagine, will be higher than this because it's kind of weird to raise taxes and go back to the next year and do it again. So once we do raise this, it probably has at least a 10-year, 10-year reprieve. So I think we should consider different amounts.
Yeah. So just there's a bunch of numbers. You can check these out online, but beer was looking at about 49 cents to the current 41 cents per gallon. Wine 54 cents to the current 45 cents. So modest increases here and there, and the list goes on. And again, that was vetoed there. But Gabby, I wanted to let you ask a question here.
Yeah. So Professor Horn, how would some of those proposed changes fit in with findings of your research that New Mexico changing or raising its alcohol tax could likely help reduce alcohol-related fatalities? Was the proposal on the table at all matching to your research?
You know, we don't prescribe a particular tax. I think the role I try to play is saying, if we pass this tax, then what do I think the outcomes will be? So we didn't have a particular tax that was in mind. I would say, as an economist, yes, a tax, any increase in tax will get us closer to historic levels or may have behavioral impacts. Again, the magnitude of the tax is large taxes will have bigger impacts and smaller taxes won't have quite as big of an impact.
And I'm assuming that just goes back to because, people will think twice spending that amount of money on the alcohol.
I think when it's in someone's brain, so we've had big taxes in Illinois and Maryland, and so when there's a big tax, you think to yourself, like we were having the conversation at the beginning, oh, I've cognitively put this in my brain that there is a tax. Maybe I'll change my purchasing decisions, where if it's a small tax, it's just kind of something that kind of invisible behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Senator Maestas, we mentioned this veto, these alcohol excise tax changes. While the governor did say in her veto message that she broadly supported changes to the alcohol excise tax, she took aim at the larger tax bill, saying in part, quote, New Mexicans deserve thoughtful, forward-looking policy, not last-minute deal-making that delays relief, ignores economic opportunity, and undermines fiscal responsibility. Again, those words from the governor in her veto message. And I wanted to ask you, Senator Maestas, you've been in the legislature a long time. It sounds like there's been a lot of thoughtful discussion put into policy changes like this. But what were your thoughts on the governor's veto, basically saying that she supported these liquor excise tax increases, but not the broader bill? Did you feel the veto was fair? What were your thoughts?
Thank you. The tax package this year I was not impressed with. I mean, it was because we have so much money, it's a lot of it was just tax credits. It was just good old-fashioned tax credits. So it was a lot of, some was good policy. Some may have been more of a giveaway type of thing. So it wasn't a good policy wonk. This tax package did not reflect 10 years of dialogue that we've had as a legislature. Granted, there's a lot of new members, a lot of new ideas, new chair on the Senate, the tax side, the House tax chair, I think it's been there only 3 years. So they did as best job as they could. The fact that the alcohol tax is in the tax package the past couple of years is a good thing. So we essentially hear all the tax proposals, and the leadership, through a collective dialogue puts, 5 or 6 or 8 of the proposals in a package, and then hopefully we find something to vote for instead of something to vote against, and it gets to the gov's desk. So it's the sausage making times 10 is our tax package, because we got to kind of consider our tax code collectively, not just individually. But anyway, this will probably come back. It'll be a good dialogue to have. It's something that you'll get a text from an old high school buddy or cousin, and unlike all the other bills that we do, but we really need to modernize how we tax alcohol. To me, the fairest way is at the point of sale with the consumer. And so with cannabis, we tax it. We call it an excise tax, but it's really a surtax. It's taxing twice the same commodity. So when you buy cannabis, you pay the GRT, and then you pay an extra percentage because it's cannabis. Alcohol, I think you would agree, has a much higher social cost than cannabis. I argued that ad nauseum in trying to legalize cannabis. But the tax on cannabis started at 12% and incrementally goes up to 18%. So by 2031, when you buy cannabis, you pay the tax, the good old-fashioned GRT, and 18% additional tax because it's cannabis. Even though we're a relatively liberal, progressive state, we're conservative as it relates to change. So we would never get that leap in one swoop. But if we were to raise it, say, put in a 2% excise tax at the point of sale and raise it to 10 years over an 8-year process, that might be palatable to folks and and local bars and restaurants who have been struggling recently don't get hit with this one-time tax.
Interesting.
Yeah, I want to talk about local bars and restaurants really quick. So I'll ask our economist here. It seems like there is still movement toward raising the liquor excise tax at some point. Is there a downside, though? Could this hurt New Mexico's critical mass of microbreweries, small wineries, or local distilleries?
Yeah, that's an important question. In fact, our first report, we were thinking about the craft beer industry, and I think there was a lot of growth. And it's a little bit interesting to think about as from my research perspective, but beer is a form of, has been a form of economic development in New Mexico. So what do you do about encouraging economic development while not necessarily encouraging a lot more alcohol consumption? And I think with the craft beer industry, as we show, the growth in the beer industry did not cause a lot of bad outcomes, at least from what like I said, we want more data, we want better data. From what I was able to get, it didn't. So we're not trying to minimize craft distillers and brewers in New Mexico. And by the way, like, breweries have very different rules. So if you go to a brewery, a lot of them enforce 3 drink limits. A lot of them close early, so you're not staying till way late. So it's just a different thing. So as you're thinking through policies for alcohol and then thinking about this, right now there's much lower excise taxes for craft breweries that produce within a certain level than big breweries. And you could preserve that if you wanted to. So I don't think you need to upend this system that we have that incentivize craft in New Mexico by passing these taxes. But you'd, of course, have to thoughtfully work through it. And I'm sure Mo is thinking, how would you create a bill that would work with all these different things? And I'm glad I got to kind of be immune to these details. But I think it's very possible to have a policy where you increase alcohol taxes while preserving economic growth in New Mexico that we've had.
And we have that's one of the things we do agree on. The folks that want to raise it, the folks that are reluctant, we agree that we should distinguish. So we have a marvelous distillery community. We call it craft brewery in statute, but microbreweries or breweries that are making homegrown distilled spirits, wines, and beers. And so we distinguish those taxes from the larger manufacturers, the Anheuser-Busch's, Jack Daniels of the world. So we really want to create a marvelous economic opportunity for distillers and brewers. And I think we have some of the best brewers in the country. And hopefully Albuquerque is known for its breweries.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
Well, what is next to address liquor excise taxes? I know you mentioned a little bit that you think this will probably come back up. We're looking at a 30-day session in the next one, and that's always a lot shorter, can be sometimes harder to arrive on big policy change very quickly. But do you think it can get done in the next session, or do you think this is still going to be kind of an uphill battle to address how we tax alcohol in New Mexico?
No, good question. I don't anticipate it getting done in a 30-day. I'm sure the bills will be introduced. I think the bills need to come from the governor's office, or frankly from the chairs of the tax committees, or the speaker's office, or the pro tem's office. The two folks spearheading the tax initiatives don't have a huge track record of passing complex legislation. This has a lot of pushback. And so I think it's a couple years away. But one dialogue that we need to have is, should we distinguish between liquor by the drink or liquor by the package? What I learned in doing the liquor license bill and doing all that research was it's liquor by the package. In other words, alcohol consumed at home that has an even higher social cost. And that having liquor by the drink is a more mature relationship with alcohol. For example, Boston, 73% of alcohol sold in Boston is by the drink. 85% of alcohol sold in New Mexico is take-home alcohol.
Oh, wow. They're going and buying the whole package.
An 18-pack on
going
a Tuesday
to Costco.
night, right? Is that,
different.
So, given the abuse and violence that happens within the home with small children, things of that nature, I think having a drink on the way home is less social cost than an 18-pack on a Tuesday night. But we have not drawn that distinction in state statute.
Interesting.
Very interesting, parts of this conversation. Professor Horn, what's next for your research? What are you looking into next?
Well, there's a lot to be done studying alcohol taxes. And so one thing, I won't bore you with the details, but there's been a lot of changes in economics in terms of better data and better methods. And we really don't have solid answers for some different things about what happens with alcohol. So one thing is that we've kind of missed in this conversation, but that's for another day probably, is that there's a difference between heavy drinkers and non-heavy drinkers. And a lot of the alcohol-related harms, particularly physically, are from heavy drinkers. Not that, if you drink 3 drinks a day, that probably will hurt your health as well. And so we can think through, or the data is better, where we can look at how does alcohol taxes, how do alcohol policies affect heavy drinkers versus non-heavy drinkers. There's also different outcomes that we care about. Does alcohol taxes affect crime? So there's better data every day on crime and other societal outcomes, and maybe even healthcare utilization. So lots of different variables that we want to look at.
Okay. Well, very interesting topic. Is there anything that we're missing, though, that you guys want to share or want the public to better understand about this issue?
Well, I was I think one thing Mo and I do agree upon from different perspectives is it should be, well, maybe you didn't say this, I don't put words, but it should be a percent, because I think legislators are tired of debating this, but one reason we're constantly debating it is because that the tax goes down every year. And so if you can have just some idea of what a tax rate should be and then put that in the code, then you wouldn't have to have these debates all the time. The second thing, just through our conversation, I just want to point out, as Mo said, sin taxes, and I actually don't know the better word. I think that is a bad word, but I don't know the correct one. But when we think about taxes, and this is the point I try to make about alcohol taxes, is there's things that I consume that may hurt my health. So if I have a second piece of pie, well, that's kind of my choice, right? And if I want to consume things that are good or bad for me, I think that's an individual's decision, and maybe we don't want to be particularly care about taxes for those things. Maybe even sugar, although sugar tax would make a lot of people a lot healthier. But alcohol is slightly different because the negative aspects of alcohol, if I drink alcohol, it could have negative consequences to me, which is fine, but it also could have negative consequences towards other people. And that's what makes alcohol special and different. I mean, there's not the only good that's like this, but it does affect other people. And I won't get into all the economic theory with you, but economists believe when a good has negative consequences on others, then some form of market intervention would be a good thing.
Yeah. Interesting.
Thank you. No, a couple things. Yeah, you're correct on the percentage. And I think just a couple things. We get criticized for not raising the alcohol tax. It is a very difficult tax to raise, number one, because it's very real to people, very real. It's regressive, which if you're more on the liberal side of politics, you're against progressive. You're against regressive tax policy, and it hits people in a very real way. It's not like the lobbyists and all this stuff. It's your cousin that's texting you. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
But number two is we got to take dollars and cents out of statutes. It's just not good. So in the decades of the teens, we had a governor that took a no tax pledge, and now we're in the 20s. We're flush with billions of dollars of cash. So we can't go more than a decade or two raising dollars and cents in the state code. And then three is I got criticized for expanding alcohol because we did the liquor license reform. What we learned is if there's more locations that you can get a drink at, you're closer to home when you go home. Now, it takes like a policy mind to get that because it's easy to argue against. But the more points of sale, the less miles people drive after that consumption. And we need to build a modern city. You know, it was just shocking to people when they'd order a mimosa at 10 in the morning on a Sunday and they'd say, we can't do that till 11. Mm-hmm. No, we have to modernize our laws, make them conducive to what people enjoy in other modern big cities. But we definitely need to bring up all of these old tax policies into the modern world. But I think we could do them incrementally and with an explanation. You don't come out of the gate and say, "I'm going to tax you $25 on every beer you drink." That was dead on arrival. A second, my colleagues messaged that as their pitch. You know, we learned from the Coke tax in Santa Fe. People don't tax people to change their behavior. Tax it to raise money and make it consistent with other commodities. And if there's a higher social cost, it should be higher than those other commodities.
Do you get the sense that people are agreeable on these two main points, like you said, the percentages and just that we need to address it in the legislature, or is this one of the more like controversial, can't get on the same page?
I think the percentages and the excise tax and the surtax, that's all policy wonk stuff. We've had 40 years of anti-tax rhetoric that we're struggling against, and we have billions of dollars sitting in the bank. So it's very difficult politically to raise any taxes at this time. But if you justify it by modernization and consistency with the tax code, I think we can get it done.
Interesting.
Sin tax is also known as the sumptuary or vice tax, according to my Googling here. So those are kind of, I think, two of the other ones that you guys were looking for, perhaps, for the name. We appreciate the conversation for both of you coming in, Professor Brady Horn and also Senator Maestas. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks again to UNM Professor Brady Horn and Senator Maestas for tackling that complex topic with us. There's a lot more to alcohol taxes than meets the eye.
Yes, and we were talking about how hopefully all of the policy wonks who are really interested in this got every little bit of that. You know, honestly, looking over some of this research has been a learning curve for me, but interesting to find out how the state taxes alcohol and also how long it has been since there has been a change. So,
and how challenging it is to get these bills passed, it seems like.
Yeah.
To get everybody agreeing upon
lawmakers, lobbyists, industry experts, economists, everybody's got to say. So it'll be interesting to see if they get it done in the next session or the next one after that. We appreciate any ideas that you've got as well. Let us know. If you got an idea, let me know at Chris McKee TV, also chris.mckee@krqe.com.
And I am Gabrielle.Burkhart at krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media. Thank you all for listening and watching.